In compound interest scenarios, the factors or the important pieces of information include the principal, which again is the amount borrowed or deposited. It is the money that starts up the transaction. In these considerations, we will also include something called the future amount, which is the amount after the interest is applied. It's not the interest, nor is it the principal, but it is the combination of the two at the end of the transaction. So the future amount is how much money you have at the end of the transaction when interest has already been applied. And then there are two other factors that we need to consider. There is a rate of interest. However, because of the structure of compound interest, we have to consider that rate of interest per period. And then we also have to, rather than think about time in terms of years, we have to think about time in terms of the number of periods that transpire for this transaction. And it's also important to note, or always important to note, that periods are based on how the interest is compounded, whether it be compounded quarterly, compounded monthly, compounded semi-annually. And this will come into bear in calculating R and N, and also in solving for P or A. Before we can get into solving the questions and calculating for P and for A, let's make sure that we can solve for R and N. Make sure that we can establish what the interest rate per period is and the number of periods in any given question. So in our example, we have 4.8% interest yearly, compounded quarterly. We're going to pay attention to the fact that it is 4.8% interest, and also, and most importantly, to the fact that it is compounded quarterly. Your interest rate per period, R, is basically all of the interest that you have applied for the entire year, the block of interest for the year, divided up into portions that are applied each period. If the interest rate is compounded quarterly, then the periods are quarters. If the interest rate is compounded monthly, the periods are months, and so on and so forth. If the interest rate is compounded quarterly, as in the example we have, then what you have is 4.8%, and I'm writing it as a fraction, 4.8 over 100 is the block of interest for the year, but the interest that you want is the interest per quarter, since it is compounded quarterly. Thus, you will take that block of interest for the year and divide it by 4. There are 4 quarters in a year, 4 quarters in any whole really. So the interest rate per quarter would be all of the interest, 4.8%, divided by 4. And this should give you a solution that you will write as a decimal value. 4.8 divided by 100, and then that answer divided by 4 should give you 0.012. And that is how you will express R, the interest rate per period. Just to recap, 4.8 over 100 is your block of interest for the year. But you are dividing that block of interest by 4 because you know that one whole year is divided into 4 quarters. And that's how you get your interest rate per period, which is really interest rate per quarter, being 0.02. And if we were to continue this, and let's say that it was a question that was considering what would happen in 3 years' time. In 3 years' time, the number of periods would not be equal to 3, because the periods are not years. If the interest rate is compounded quarterly, then the periods are quarters, and there are 4 quarters each year. So in 3 years' time, you will have 12 periods. Again, your 3 years is the number of years for the transaction, but you must multiply that by the number of periods within each year. In this case, the number of quarters. Four quarters each year, which means that the number of periods is 12 periods, which is really saying 12 quarters. 4 quarters make up 1 year, another 4 for the next year, another 4 for the third year. That's 12 quarters in total, 12 periods in total. So when we're solving for R or solving for N, we will have to factor in how the interest rate is compounded, and you will consider those periods, how many of those periods make up 1 year, and you will divide your block of interest by that number of periods that make up 1 year, and you will multiply the number of years by the number of periods that make up 1 year. That's to solve for R, and that's to solve for N. Let's take a look at another example. In this case, we have 7.2% interest per annum, which is the same thing as yearly. 7.2% interest per annum compounded monthly. So we are still trying to express R, which is the interest rate per period. We have a block of interest for the year, 7.2, and our interest is compounded monthly. So to solve for R, we would say the block of interest for the year is 7.2%, 7.2 over 100. We're going to divide that up by the number of periods that make a year. In this case, the periods are months, since the interest is compounded monthly, and 12 months make up a year. So we're taking that 7.2% and dividing it up by 12, which would give us 0.006. And just as a reminder, again, you're always going to express this R, interest rate per period, as a decimal value. 7.2% is our block of interest for the year, and we're going to divide that by 12 because the periods are months and there are 12 months in a year. And if I were to say that this transaction continues for 4 years, and I want to know, what will be the result after 4 years, then the number of periods is going to be how many periods are in those 4 years. So the periods are months based on the fact that the interest rate is compounded monthly, and there are 12 months every year, so it would be over 4 years, it would be 4 times 12, which equals 48 periods. Four years and 12 months each year, or 12 periods each year, because the periods are months. And that is how we solve for R and for N. And we use R and N when we are trying to calculate P and A in compound interest scenarios, but also when we are calculating for P and common A. They mean two different things, But in mortgage scenarios, we also use R and N, interest rate per period and the number of periods. So it is important that you have a firm grasp on how to solve for R and N given the information that has been provided. Just as a reminder, the periods are based on the way the interest rate is compounded, and the interest rate per period is found by dividing the block of interest by the number of periods in 1 year, and the number of periods is found by multiplying the span of the transaction in years by the number of periods that make up 1 year.